Hello my beautiful friends, welcome back to my channel. It is so good to have you back here again for a new episode, and if you are new here, hello and welcome. Why don't you stick around and see what kind of shocking but also very interesting true crime story I have for you today. And of course, please do subscribe to the channel. From now on, I'm also going to be giving out a disclaimer which goes along with every content warning of every single episode. And that disclaimer is, my channel is not meant to disrespect any of the victims or the family of the victims I talk about in these videos. The information that I relay out to my audience is simply just research that I found from different sources of the internet. And I put it all together into one YouTube video. The main purpose of my channel is for educational and awareness purposes of the different types of crimes that we face on a daily basis. And of course, before I get into the episode, I have to give out a content warning that in this case, I will be talking about murder, sexual assault, robbery, as well as grievous bodily harm. So if you are sensitive to that type of content, then viewer discretion is very much advised. Alright, even though I had already uploaded an episode for this week, I had to take it down for reasons I do not believe I'm at liberty to disclose. But of course, to make it up to you guys, I quickly started working on another episode, and god damn it, is it messed up. Oh my god, it's so messed up. So take your seats as I tell you guys about the Quarry River Killer, one of South Africa's most coldest and scariest serial killers to date. It all started in 2002, between January and November, when a number of 5 bodies of women were discovered. The police were hunting down a man they had believed to be responsible for these 5 murders, and his name is Elias Shokwe. And even though Elias himself was a serial killer known as the Highwayman Murderer, he was not the one the police were looking for, because Elias was actually in prison between January and September of 2002 until he got arrested again in November. So obviously he couldn't have murdered these women while he was in prison. So this meant that the police had another serial killer on the loose. On January 13th of 2002, the first victim of the 5 that were discovered that year was found, and her body was found naked and she was lying on her back. But she was also very badly decomposed, so this became a challenge for investigators when they tried to determine the cause of her death. Then on April 22nd in 2002, the second victim's body was found, and she was already in a much more advanced state of decomposition than the first victim, and her body was taken to the coroner. And when she got to the coroner and was examined, it was found out that there was some blunt force trauma that she suffered, and this was believed to have been the cause of her death. Then on June 13th in 2002, the third victim's body was found at the Quarry River in Pretoria, where the other 2 victims were found as well. And she was actually found not that far from where the 2 other victims were found. And when she was found, she was naked from the waist down, and the jersey that she had on was pulled all the way up, exposing her breasts. And like victim number 2, there were also some signs of blunt force trauma which were found on her and were believed to have been the cause of her death as well. And just a few days later, on June 21st in 2002, the body of victim number 4 was also discovered. And I personally think that the reason it didn't take that long for them to find her body was because of the fact that she was only found a few feet away from where the other victims were found in that Quarry River. Her pants were unbuttoned, and when she was taken in for an examination, the toxicology report came back saying that she had an overdose of antidepressants in her system, and she also had an anesthetic which was normally used as a numbing agent, but the anesthetic can also be absorbed into the bloodstream. But investigators didn't believe that these were in any way related to the cause of her death. What they had in mind was maybe this was medicine that was prescribed to her, and they could use this as a way to identify her. So maybe once they put out information about the murder out there, someone who knows her or the family that she has might actually come out to identify her. And this is because identifying a victim, especially in a murder case, is very crucial to the investigation. But the difference with this victim though was that unlike victim number 2 and victim number 3, she didn't show any signs of blunt force trauma on her head, but she actually showed the signs of blunt force trauma on her liver. Her cause of death was not able to be determined, and when investigators tried to examine her for any signs of sexual assault, none could be traced. But even though there weren't any signs of sexual assault in her private parts, 2 of the investigators requested that vaginal swabs be taken anyway in case any DNA evidence could be left behind by the killer. And since the bodies had already started decomposing at this point, that means the skin of the victims was in a very bad state. So a technique that was used to identify a victim by their fingerprints, even when their body has started to decompose, had to be used. It turns out that when the body is in the process of decomposing, the skin starts to tear away and wear off very easily, and this is called skin slippage. And this makes it very difficult for investigators to get any fingerprints from the bodies of unidentified victims. So when this happens, the pathologist would have to carefully remove the part of the skin of the victim that has the victim's fingerprints on it, and after that they would carefully have to put it on their own gloved hands to make the fingerprints clear enough to be able to work with and to be able to be analyzed. They did that to try to use the fingerprints of the victims to identify them from the citizen database, but they never got a match. Then they also tried the technique of facial reconstruction, which is used by facial anatomy experts to try to see how the victims could have possibly looked like before their faces were changed by decomposition. They did this so they can be able to put out pictures of the victims out there for the public to see, in hopes that someone or maybe a family could come forward to identify the victims, but unfortunately even that didn't work and they still weren't able to identify these victims. And after some time, it seemed like the killer had taken some kind of a break or went into hiding, because investigators were no longer finding any more bodies of murdered women. And it seemed like they couldn't find any more bodies for over 4 years, from 2002 until 2006. A detective named Detective Warrant Officer Butibaloi was in the process of investigating 2 murders that occurred in that year. And it turns out that both these women were found in the same Quarry River in Pretoria West, where the other 5 victims of 2002 were also found. And when he looked at these victims, he came to the conclusion that both these women have been killed or could have been killed by the same person. So he contacted the CPU, which were the investigators who were working on the murders of the 5 victims that were found in 2002. And when he talked to one of the investigator told him about the 5 women who were found in 2002, and they both started thinking that the killer could have returned. The first who was found by the detective was found on January 2nd in 2006, and like the 5 other victims of 2002, she was found in the river just floating around naked. And when the cause of her death was investigated, it was determined that she died from blunt force trauma to her chest and also strangulation. So yeah, the similarities between the 2 cases were starting to point out to the idea that the same killer from 2002 could have returned. And if there's one thing we know about serial killers thus far, is that they almost never change their MO. Their methods of killing almost stay the same. This woman was also never identified, but the brighter side of this was that investigators were able to find traces of male DNA on her body. The body of the second victim of 2006 was found on January 19th in that year, and like the other victims, she was also found near the same river, naked in a field. The unfortunate part is that her body was in a very bad state of decomposition, so no DNA evidence could be collected in or on her body, and she was also never identified. Then a month later, on February 27th, the body of another woman was also found, and she was also found at the same location as the other victims. But when the cause of her death was investigated, investigators actually found out that the killer most likely left her alive, but she was unconscious in the river, so she ended up drowning, and the cause of her death was ruled as drowning. And again, she also wasn't identified. Then 2 months later, on April 21st in 2006, another victim's body was found. And this made it the fourth body to be discovered in 2006 in just a span of a few months. She was badly decomposed in a way that insects were starting to feed on her body, and by the looks of these insects, it was appearing that she had been dead for about 14 days. Oh, and I think I should mention that when a body starts to decompose or is in the process of decomposition, there are insects that begin to feed on it after a certain period of time. Forensic investigators such as entomologists actually have the knowledge of these different types of insects, maggots or bugs or what have you, and they use that knowledge to, one, determine the stages of decomposition that the body is in, and two, to be able to determine how long a person has been dead for. And that is why they managed to tell that she had been dead for about 14 days. But even though they were able to determine how long she had been dead for, they were not able to determine the cause of her death, and they also weren't able to identify her. Then on the very same day, on April 21st in 2006, the fifth victim of 2006 was also discovered, but her body was even way more decomposed than that of the woman I just spoke about. She had a ligature wrapped tightly around her neck, but because of how badly she had started to decompose, it couldn't be determined with absolute certainty what the cause of her death was, but eventually investigators theorized that she could have been strangled to death. But even though the cause of her death couldn't be definitively identified, she was actually the first of the victims to be identified. Her clothing and missing person reports that were put out about her, and the objects that were found around her body when investigators were investigating the crime scene, made it easy to identify her as Evelyn Dube. And it turns out that on March 19th of 2006, a month before she was found dead, Evelyn left her home to go to the township of Olivenholzbusch to sell some of the items that she had with her. She never came back from her trip that day, and the evidence that was collected from her and all around her indicated that she had been dead for 30 days. And just 9 days later, on April 30th of 2006, the sixth victim was found, and her vest was pulled all the way up, exposing her breasts. Investigators also found ligature marks on her neck, and when they did vaginal swabs, they also managed to find some male DNA, which they took and managed to form a DNA profile with. And this woman was identified to be 25-year-old Molina Gunduza. And it turns out that Molina had also left her home to go to the township of Olivenholzbusch to sell some stainless kitchen equipment. And this was also the township where Evelyn Dube was last seen alive. Then in May of 2006, a task force was put on the case because now there were 6 bodies of women that were found, and investigators still had 5 women who were found dead from 2002. And obviously these murders were linked to each other, so now the police needed the special skills that came with task force investigators. The task force went over to the crime scenes to examine the place a little bit more, and when they got there, they were quickly approached by a security guard at the entrance of the quarry, and he told them that he was with 2 men who told him that they had just seen a dead body. So the task force followed the security guard to where the 2 men were, and when they got there, they were asking them if they could take them to where they found the human body. One of the men refused to go back, but the other one agreed to take the task force to where the body was found. But as soon as they were driving to the scene, this guy just jumped out of the car and bolted the hell up out of there. And investigators did not see this coming, because before that happened, they were all just talking just a minute ago, and now this guy just got out of the car and just ran the hell out of there. At first, they thought that he could have been the killer that they were looking for, but eventually it was found out that he was not the guy they were looking for. But then why in the world would he just run away after agreeing to help them find the body? That was weird. So the task force drove back to find the other guy, and when they found him, they pleaded with him to please show them where the body was, and he agreed after they let him know what happened. The woman was found with her dress pulled all the way to her waist, but she was badly decomposed and could not be identified. Then on May 31st, police decided to go out with search dogs to the quarry to see if they could find any more bodies out there, but they didn't find anything. At this point in the case, investigators decided to get the help of Professor David Cantor of the University of Liverpool after they sent him some coordinates of where the murders were found. And he partnered up with a Canadian academic by the name of Kim Rosmo, and together they used this concept called geographic profiling to help with the investigation. Now, geographic profiling talks about the theory that serial killers don't normally change the place of killing their victims. They have one place of comfort that they always use to operate in, and the killing areas would normally be around their homes, places of work, or areas that they were very familiar with. And this helps them to be able to identify where the killer could possibly be living. And once they used the GPS coordinates of where the bodies were found with the software that Professor David Cantor and Canadian academic Kim Rosmo developed, they were able to identify that there were buildings around the areas where the bodies were found. Then on July 4th in 2006, the task force and a few backup officers went to the buildings to check them out. They found the phones which belonged to the people who lived in those buildings, and they wanted to see if they could match any of those phones to the victims that were identified in 2006. But even though they never got a match from any of those phones, it gave them hope that the investigation was finally moving forward. But then just later on in that month, on July 31st in 2006, the 8th victim's body was found. And even though she had started to decompose, investigators were able to find puncture wounds to her chest, like she was stabbed with something. And after doing the process of facial reconstruction, they were able to identify her as 30-year-old Selina Mahlangu. And Selina had actually been reported missing. Selina had actually been reported missing by her boyfriend when she went missing around the 29th of May in 2006. And it turns out that she left after she got a call about a job offer. She went to the township of Olivenholzbosch, where the other victims were also found, to meet a man who called himself Jabu, because this was where the job meeting location was at. And when she got there, she got inside while her boyfriend waited outside. And then a few minutes later, she came back outside and told her boyfriend that everything was fine and there was nothing to worry about. And after that, her boyfriend left. And that was the last time he saw her alive. And investigators found out that Selina's phone had been used even after she had been killed. So it also became a very important part of this investigation. And as they were still examining the crime scene, another body was found just a few feet away from where Selina's body was found. This made it the 9th body that was found in 2006, and when you combine it with the 5 victims who were found in 2002, this made it 14 women who were killed or believed to have been killed by the same person. And on this woman's chest, neck, and abdomen were similar puncture wounds that were found on Selina Mahlangu's chest. And it was believed that she could have been stabbed with a screwdriver. On August 18th in 2006, a funeral was held for 5 of the unidentified victims, and hundreds of people came out to attend. And it turned out that it was later discovered that the killer was also among the people who attended that funeral. And you know, I've come across cases where it was said that serial killers would either return to the scene to look at the remains of their victims or report the murders themselves if they find out or if they feel like the police are being a bit too slow, or to even help the victims' families try to find these dead relatives knowing that they're the cause, just to get a thrill out of the whole thing, or just to watch the people suffer, because this would somehow make them relive their moments of when they killed those victims. So obviously, he was one of those. And another thing that they found was that after Selina Mahlangu was reported missing, her boyfriend suddenly vanished. And they found this very suspicious. So they started looking for him, and they found him at a shopping center and they took him into custody. And when they were trying to see if he was the man that they were looking for, they eventually found out that he wasn't, because his DNA did not match any of the DNA that was found on the crime scenes. So he had to be released. Investigators realized that the common factor that they got with the identified victims was that they were murdered on Sundays. So the task force decided to go up to the quarry where the killer usually left his victims, and what they did was they did a bit of a stakeout and hid themselves somewhere near where the victims were found to try to see if they could find anyone or if they could see anyone who might seem a little bit suspicious. But nothing happened on that day. Then on September 1st in 2006, the 10th victim was found, and unlike a lot of the others, she wasn't so badly decomposed, so investigators had hopes that they could retrieve some useful DNA evidence from her. The woman was identified as Elizabeth Mabasa, and she was last seen on August 30th when she left work at Moyloft, Pretoria. But when she was killed, it seemed like whoever killed her took her pants, underwear, and phone because they were nowhere to be found. A pathologist was then called out to the scene since the body was still in the early stages of decomposition. So this meant that there could still be some precious evidence on her that many may miss, but a pathologist would be able to notice. And when the pathologist was working on the body, it was found that there was some dried up white substance on her body, and it was believed to have been some semen that was left behind by the killer. And the pathologist was also quick enough to cover up the hands of Elizabeth to preserve any DNA evidence that could still be under her fingernails. This was to make sure that it doesn't get damaged by any of the elements, because if it does, it would be contaminated and they wouldn't be able to use it. Also, let me give you guys a quick tip. If you are attacked by anyone at any point, be sure to scratch them as much as you can and pull out their hair. That way, if you do survive, or even if you get killed, and God forbid that happen, you can be able to leave out some traces of their DNA in your fingernails or in your hands. The cause of Elizabeth's death was concluded to be strangulation and also blunt force trauma to her heart. And it was also discovered that she suffered some acute bleeding. And another heartbreaking thing about this was that Elizabeth was 12 weeks pregnant when she got killed. And then 4 days later, after Elizabeth Mabasa was killed, the task force got a call which seemed to be a major breakthrough in their investigation. They got a call from the lab that a DNA match had been made to the DNA that they found on the scene. It turns out that on the database, the police had the DNA of a man who was arrested in 2002 for trying to sexually assault his girlfriend's child. So when the current DNA evidence was collected and analyzed, it was a match to that man's DNA. And again, just to confirm, the DNA of that man was taken and compared to the DNA that was found on another victim's body, and it was also a match. And the name that they got from the DNA results was the name of a man named Richard Jabulani Nyauza. It turns out that after Richard got arrested for the charge of attempted sexual assault, he was put in custody between 2002 and 2005, waiting for his trial. At first, he was found guilty of the charge, but after his sentencing was handed out, it was found out that the court that gave out his sentencing did not have the proper mandate to give out his sentencing, so the sentencing had to be given by the High Court. But instead of just sentencing this psycho, the High Court actually overturned his guilty verdict to not guilty. And just like that, in November of 2005, he was released and he was free to walk, which obviously led to his killing spree again in 2006. So the task force contacted the woman who was dating Richard back in 2002, the one whose child Richard tried to sexually assault. And she told him that she knew that Richard was released, and as a matter of fact, she also knew exactly where he lived, so she can always keep her child safe. It turns out that Richard only lived 1 kilometer away from where the victims of 2006 were found. And at this point, we also know that that is where the victims of 2002 were also found. And this confirms 3 things that we already know or now know about serial killers. And that is, 1, serial killers prefer to use the same location for killing their victims. And this was confirmed by the theory of geographic profiling that was presented by Professor David Cantor and Canadian academic Kim Rosmo. And 2 is that serial killers only stop killing if they get killed or if they get arrested, or if they decide to go into hiding. And this was proven by the fact that when Richard got arrested and was put in custody between 2002 and November of 2005, no more bodies were found, and they were only found when he started killing again in 2006 in January on the 2nd of that month. And the third thing that it confirms is that most serial killers do not wander off from their place of comfort, such as their homes, their workplaces, or places that they're very familiar with. And this was proven by the fact that we've just talked about how he was found out that he lives just 1 kilometer away from where the victims were found. So he never went too far away from his place of comfort, which was his home. Investigators also kept a close eye on the signal of the phone of one of the identified victims, and they found out that the phone kept pinging from different cell towers, and this phone belonged to Selina Mahlangu. And when Selina went missing, her boyfriend told the police that she was last seen when she was going to go meet up with a man who called himself Jabu. And what is Richard's middle name? Jabu Lani. Too damn good to be a coincidence. The police then went over to Richard's place to arrest him, but he wasn't around. So they left an undercover cop by the name of Officer Mokoena, and he was going to be on the lookout for when Richard eventually came back. So he was at a nearby bar while his backup was at a nearby gas station, so Richard doesn't see them at all. And just moments later, Officer Mokoena alerted his backup that 2 men were approaching Richard's house, and a few minutes after that, these 2 men were quickly surrounded by the whole squad of police. And when they were taken into custody, it was found out that these 2 men were Richard and his brother, and they were put in separate police cars. And when the police started looking through Richard's house, they found Selina Mahlangu's cell phone and Elizabeth Mabasa's handbag and her phone as well. And a little while after he was arrested, Richard started giving out a confession about his involvement in the murders, and he was even showing them the crime scenes where the victims were found, which of course only the killer could have known to a precise detail. Richard also gave out in great detail how he killed and also physically assaulted the victims, which confirmed the causes of death and the injuries that were found on the victims' bodies. So this was definitely the man that they were looking for. And when he was questioned about why he did what he did, he just said that he was acting out his vengeance against women because of one woman who infected him with HIV. So this got him to have a lot of hatred towards women. On September 14th in 2006, Richard was charged with murder and he never got bail. But since his brother was also arrested with him on that day, he had to be released because he had no part in this. And even though Richard was now in custody, on the 17th of September in 2006, just 3 days after he was charged with murder, the body of Kuna Rosina Masvana was found. And at first, investigators thought that they were dealing with a copycat killer because the man they were looking for was already in custody. A copycat killer is someone who commits murder based on the methods of a known serial killer to make it look as if like the serial killer is the one who committed the murder, therefore throwing the police off track. But it turns out that Kuna went missing and was killed in May of 2006. And the fact that her body was still in good condition almost shocked investigators into thinking that someone else was starting to kill people now. But it was discovered that she died in winter, so the cold temperatures actually preserved her body all the way through the winter season until she was found in September. But ultimately it was confirmed that she was one of Richard's victims, which to this time, at this point, brought his total body count to 16 confirmed kills. And you know, to be a serial killer, you only have to kill 3 people minimum. So Richard definitely went way above the requirements. And out of the 16 murders that were committed, physical evidence was only found in 8 of those murders. So the prosecution wanted to prosecute Richard only of those 8 cases, which meant that the other 8 victims might not even get true justice. But this was overturned when the idea of linkage analysis evidence was brought forth by the IPU. And what it basically meant was it was now possible to link all murders to the same killers even without physical evidence. And if they use Richard's case as one of the first of its kind, then many serial killer cases in the future can also be handled this way when the killers get prosecuted. So now Richard was definitely going to get prosecuted for all 16 murders. And as his trial was about to go on, it was also revealed that Richard was actually wanted in the Northwest Province for the attempted murder of a woman by the name of Jane Saramani. And it turns out that Richard beat her up and attacked her with a screwdriver when he was making a delivery for his boss. But luckily, when he left her, he thought she was dead, but she was still alive and she managed to report him to the police. The unfortunate part was that she was pregnant when Richard attacked her, and sadly, she lost her baby. And after this case was brought to light, special permission was granted that the attempted murder of Jane also be added to the charges of the trial of Richard Nyauza, even though it happened in a different jurisdiction. Jane and a witness only took 10 and 5 seconds to identify Richard as the man who attacked her. So again, authorities definitely had the right man. Richard's trial started on October 23rd in 2007, and this psycho pleaded not guilty to all the charges that were laid against him, which makes no sense because he already gave out confessions to the murders and he also showed investigators where to find the victims. He was charged on a total of 24 charges, and those were 16 counts of murder, 3 counts of robbery, 4 counts of sexual assault, and 1 count of attempted murder. And you know, when Jane testified, it was actually very heartbreaking. She was talking about how the entire attack affected her life. She had lost any trust that she had in people, she lost her baby, and now she was also partially blind due to the part of her head where she got stabbed. A total of 18 witnesses testified in this trial, and you're not going to believe this. When Jane was testifying, crying about the trauma that she suffered at the hands of this man, he was actually laughing at her as if he was watching something very funny. And at some point during the trial, he also changed his statements about the confession that he gave and about the times when he took out the investigators to go point out where the victims were eventually found. He said that he was actually drugged and forced by the police to give out those confessions and to do everything else that they wanted him to do. But it turned out that everything that happened that day was videotaped, and when the videotapes were analyzed, it was concluded that none of what he said about being drugged and being forced was true. And in fact, the only medication that he took, the only drugs that he took were his ARVs for his HIV. On November 5th in 2007, Richard Jabulani Nyauza was found guilty of all the charges that were laid against him. And man, did he get a hefty sentence. He got a very hefty sentence, which of course was well deserved considering what he did. But damn, he got sentenced to 16 life sentences for all 16 murders. He also got sentenced to 80 years in prison for the sexual assaults. And then he got 45 years for the robberies. So his ass is definitely not going anywhere. And when his sentencing was handed out, Richard was actually just smiling like he was getting the best news of his life. And when he was asked in one interview about how he felt, he just said that he felt nothing. And to him, it didn't feel like anything had changed. You know what? This man defeats me. You know what? I'm just dumbfounded at this man. Just let it be known that this man defeats me. But yeah, guys, that was the bone-chilling story of Richard Jabulani Nyauza. And if we have been looking for the devil in human form, I believe that we have found him. And I honestly hope that he suffers for the things that he did to these women. And of course, rest in peace to all his victims. And that is all that I have for you guys on this episode. I would love to know what you think about this one. So please do let me know in the comment section down below. And thank you for hanging out with me today. I appreciate your support so much. And again, if you are new here, come over to the other side. Stop looking from the other side of the fence and just subscribe to the channel for more true crime content. And if you want to check out my previous episodes, I will leave 2 of them right here on the screen for you so you can see what else I've talked about in the past and you could enjoy those videos too. But with that being said, I will see you guys in the next episode. Enjoy the rest of your day, take care of yourselves, and until next time, cheers.